The Canon R1 is a powerhouse. Fast action, low light, or clean portrait, this camera can do it all. But getting the best out of it, that definitely takes more than just turning it on. So let's jump right in and let me walk you through everything you need to know to unlock the full potential of your R1. I'm Wegener, and for over 20 years I've been a professional photographer capturing unique bird photos and videos and teaching all of you to create your own masterpieces. In this video I will show you the most important settings and tweaks I've done to my R1 body. If you want to see every single setting that I've changed and also get my camera setup file that lets you load all my settings onto your own R1 with just one click, check out my brand new R1 PDF setup guide that I've linked for you down there in the description. My completely redesigned setup guide will guide you through every setting step by step and also give you explanations and recommendations where needed. Or you simply load my camera setup file and have all my settings installed on your own camera in no time. Enough with the talk, now let's look at the most important changes we can make on our R1s. So let's get into the photo settings first, and here we start with the red menu where we make many important changes. In the first step we can select the JPEG or HEIF quality if we want to shoot in RAW or C-RAW, and also if we want to shoot in full frame or some sort of crop or aspect ratio. I don't use JPEG or HEIF, so I'll leave that menu untouched, and I'm also not selecting any sort of cropping on the R1 because we only have 24 megapixels, so applying the 1.6 crop makes the files too small for me, and I rather crop afterwards if I need a crop. The important section here is the RAW or C-RAW selection. In most cases, I would recommend to shoot in C-RAW or compressed RAW because the difference between RAW and C-RAW is marginal when it comes to image quality, but C-RAW gives us much smaller files and in return a much bigger buffer, which can be helpful if we shoot a lot of fast action or have action that drags out over an extended period of time. And as we can see in this black cockatoo example, even a fairly underexposed image of a dark bird can still be lifted up enough in C-RAW and get me great details. In the third red menu, I make a few changes. The first one is the picture style. It affects the look of JPEGs and HEIF images, and it also affects the look of the RAW preview that we get on the back of our cameras. So even though I'm not shooting in JPEG, I like to tweak the picture style to the point where the sharpness and look of the back of the camera preview matches my RAW files as much as possible. And therefore I like to set the picture style to standard. And once I'm in the submenu, I also press Info and slightly increase the sharpness to 6 on the standard picture style profile. The second item I like to change here is from sRGB to Adobe RGB, but this is also something that we can change later on when processing our RAW files, but I just like to have everything in Adobe RGB so I never have to remember to change anything over. The other items I usually leave unchanged because they often only affect JPEG, but one item you could try out would be the highlight tone priority. This sometimes can help you to have more detail in your highlights, but in return it gives you a little bit more noise in the shadow. So most of the time I turn that off, but if you're dealing with very bright areas in your images, this could be something you might want to try out, for instance. In the fourth red menu, I don't make too many changes, but one thing I always like to change is to go from the automatic white balance to a custom white balance, because shooting with the custom white balance anywhere between like 5200 and 5600 Kelvin usually gives me the best and cleanest RAW files. Everything else in this menu I turn off pretty much because some of these items like the long exposure noise reduction can actually slow down your camera. In the sixth tab of the red menu, we have a few important changes to make. And the first one here is the pre-continuous shooting or pre-capture. So what pre-capture does is that the R1, once you half press the shutter button, will record a continuous loop of images, and when you actually press the shutter button, it will write the last half second of those images to your card even before you had actually pressed the shutter button. So if you're waiting for bird to take off and you just miss the moment it takes off, you will still actually have that on your card if you have pre-capture enabled. So I think in most situations this is a cool feature, even though it will write 20 extra images to your memory card every time you use it. What you will notice in the red menu and many other menus is that if you select certain options like pre-capture or blackout free shooting, that will in return disable or gray out many other menu items. That's not really a problem, but if you for instance can't access a certain menu item, it's likely because you've selected an option that disables that because it's not compatible with that menu item. The second item I like to adjust in this menu is the drive mode. And on the R1, I do this a little bit differently to other cameras. The reason is that we have the double pressed AF on button on the camera. And what I want to do later on in the green custom button menu is to assign the AF on button to shoot at the second highest frames per second on half press and then shoot at the highest frames per second on full press. And for that to work, I have to select the second highest drive mode in this menu. How many frames per second each of the drive modes have, we can actually adjust later on in the orange menu number 4. I don't really change anything else in this menu, but one thing people might get confused about is the silent shooting. You don't want to select silent shooting because that means that the camera doesn't make any sounds. It doesn't even, for instance, put the shutter down to protect the sensor when you turn the camera off. Silent shooting is different to having no noise. If you want to change the noise levels or shutter sound on your camera, we do that later on in the yellow menu and not here. So my recommendation is definitely to turn off silent mode unless you're shooting in a church, for instance. In the 8 thread menu, I like to turn off any image review because I just find it annoying, and whenever I want to actually review an image, I can just press the replay button on the back of the camera. The other item I like to turn on here is the blackout free shooting, so I don't have any blackout between images in a burst of images. You'll notice, however, though, that if you turn on blackout free shooting, that it will disable or gray out some of the other items. The 9 thread menu is an important one, and I will make a few changes here. It basically lets us decide what items and settings we see on the EVF and the rear LCD screen. So for that, we go to Shooting Info Display, and the first one is the Screen Info settings. If we access that submenu, we will see that there's currently 6 options ticked. So whenever you have the rear screen active on the back of your R1 and you press the Info button, it will toggle through all these 6 settings. Personally, I find that's a little bit too much. So what I often like to do is I untick some of these settings that I don't like, and then I basically create my one main go-to setting. So for instance, I select option 1 or 2 or 3, whichever one I like the best. I press Info, and that lets me go to the sort of sub menu, and I can add or take away items from that one menu option. And next we can do the same thing for the viewfinder info settings as well. In this submenu, we only have 3 options, but I still think that is too much. So usually untick 1 or 2 of the options and then press Info to access the submenu of the remaining options and then add the histogram to that option. So basically creating my own perfect viewfinder screen where I see all the settings and also the small histogram. We press OK to confirm, and that brings us back to the Shooting Info Display submenu. And here I make a few more changes, the main one being the histogram display being set to brightness and the size to small. And then I also like to turn on the battery percentage so that I rather see the percentage instead of those bars. And at the very bottom, we have another item that's called vertical exposure level, and I turn that off. I think it's actually on by default, and that means that exposure level is not at the bottom, but rather on the right-hand side. And I think most people don't like that. They rather have the exposure meter on the bottom. Now press Menu to get back to the 9th tab, and here I make 2 more changes. First of all, I set the viewfinder display frame rate to smooth. And then at the bottom is a very important one, the auto power off settings. And I like to set that to high because that stops the camera from overheating so quickly. On the standard setting, you might get an overheating warning here and there, even when shooting a lot of pre-capture. But on the high setting, I never had the R1 overheat. Let's move on to the pink autofocusing menu. And on the R1, just like on all my other mirrorless cameras, I like to use at least double, if not triple back button autofocusing. Having spot autofocus as my base autofocusing mode gives me full control over the camera and allows me to focus on whatever I want, whenever I want. With the spot autofocus, the idea is that I can move the autofocusing field all over the viewfinder, select a particular area, and then focus exactly on that spot. This can be great for pre-focusing, or if I have multiple birds in my viewfinder, or if the camera is stuck on the background and I need to bring it back closer towards me. On the other hand, the spot autofocus is not good if you want to track your subject all over the viewfinder, for instance. And this is where the eye-tracking autofocus comes in. I usually assign that to the AF on button, and when I press that button, the camera will detect the subject all over the viewfinder and then also track it all over my viewfinder, giving me fantastic results for perch birds and especially for action shots. And on the R1 in particular, the eye-tracking autofocus works really well. To get the full functionality of the double back button autofocus, we not only need to make changes in the pink menu, but also later on in the green custom button menu. And what's most important here is that you don't get concerned if certain areas will get grayed out once I select the spot autofocus with no tracking. That is totally fine and doesn't mean that the camera won't work properly anymore, because later on when we assign the functions for the AF on button in the green menu, whatever we assign there will override what's in the pink menu anyways. So let's jump into the menu and set it all up properly. First of all, I like to use servo autofocus all the time. And because I disable the focusing from the shutter button and only focus with the rear buttons, I never need the one-shot autofocus mode. Because whenever I want my focus to stay on a certain place, I simply let the back button go, and then I just take photos with the shutter button, and the shutter button doesn't refocus anymore, basically acting like a one-shot mode. Next, when it comes to the AF area, in this pink menu, I want to select my base autofocusing mode. And in this case, I want to select spot autofocus with no tracking. It's basically like the autofocus you've been used to from your DSLR cameras. And as you can see, because we have selected spot with no tracking indicated by the little lock icon, a few items in this menu and also the next menu will be grayed out now, but that is not a problem. If you're concerned about this and don't believe me, you could go back and select a different autofocusing area that has tracking enabled that lets you, for instance, select the subject to detect, but it's really not necessary. You will also see that I don't have all AF areas activated because just like with the viewfinder settings, I only like to activate the modes that I'm actually using because then it's easier to toggle through the remaining ones if I want to switch between two different modes. And we can select later on in the 5th pink tab which of these areas we actually want to activate or deactivate. Because we have selected the mode with no tracking, all the items in the 2nd pink menu are grayed out and we don't actually need to make any changes. Since the introduction of the R5 Mark II, the 3rd pink tab looks a little bit different now because we don't have all these different modes available anymore. We just have auto or manual available. And I've had the best results either using auto and 0 or pressing rate and then changing it to auto and +1. And what that does is that it makes the autofocus quite aggressive and it constantly tries to kind of refocus. But because the latest Canon autofocus seems to be a little bit hyperactive, I've found that setting it to a more aggressive setting actually gives me better results on the R5 Mark II and the R1 compared to setting it to more locked on settings where it tends to sometimes get stuck on the perch, for instance. And my recommendation here would be if you feel like the autofocus is too aggressive or too quickly jumps onto another subject, maybe dial it back a bit. And if you feel like it gets stuck on the perch a lot, for instance, dial it up a little bit. In the 4th pink tab, I also made a few changes. The server first image priority I like to set to release priority, so whenever I press the shutter button, the camera will also fire. If you set that to sort of acquiring focus first, what might happen is that you have a strange delay when you press the shutter button. That's really something that I don't like. There's also another item, the preview autofocus, that Canon sneakily has renamed, and it's basically continuous autofocus in photo mode, which is terrible. It means the camera will never stop focusing, and wherever your autofocusing field is, the camera will try to focus on, usually meaning the camera ends up being stuck on the background. So my recommendation is to turn that not on unless you have a specific reason for wanting your camera to continuously focus even if you don't press any button. There's one more interesting item in this menu, and that is called lens draft when autofocus impossible. And I like to set that to on even for long lenses, although it goes against what Canon recommends, but I think it just works better. In my experience, this setting set to on works much better because I can basically focus on whatever distance I want. Whereas with this setting off, I always have to precisely pre-focus or the camera won't focus at all. In the 5th pink autofocusing menu, I just make a few changes. First of all, here we can select which autofocusing areas we want to activate or disable. And I just like to activate the ones that I'm actually using and disable all the others. So if I now toggle through the different AF area options on the back of the camera with the MFN button, I can really quickly change between the ones I'm using rather than having to go through all of them. And the second option I like to adjust here is the orientation linked autofocusing points, because I find it very helpful to have a different point for vertical shooting and for horizontal shooting. So if I switch between the two, the autofocusing point is not always on the wrong side. So I go in there and I enable separate autofocus points, points only. In the 6th pink menu, we have a few options related to manual autofocusing. And then we have the last option called Lens Electronic Manual Focus, and I definitely want to make sure that that is set to on, because that allows me to always interfere with the manual focus while using the lens. If this is off and you turn your manual focus ring while focusing, nothing will happen. And that was already the pink menu for us, and because we're going to assign most settings actually in the green custom button menu, we didn't have to make too many changes in this pink menu, but the ones we did are quite important when it comes to the performance of the camera. The blue menu has a lot of options, but I leave a lot of them unchanged. In the first few tabs, for instance, we can select in-camera upscaling, but that's something that I don't usually use and it only works with JPEGs. In the 3rd blue menu, I make a couple changes. First, I go to view from last scene and I enable that. And that basically means that if you go through a few hundred images, look at one, go out of the playback menu and then back in, it doesn't default back to the last photo you've taken, but rather go back to the position that you've last looked at, which is definitely nice if you're looking through a lot of photos. And the second menu point I changed here is the magnification, where I go to actual size, magnify position from focus point, and maintain position enable. So whenever I press the little magnifying button on the back of my camera, it will zoom in directly to 100% and somewhere to the area where my autofocus field has been as well, which gives me the best option to quickly just zoom into my image and check if it's sharp or not. And in the fourth blue menu, there's also one important setting that I changed that is called the highlight alert or blinkies. With this option activated, the camera will give us a visual representation of areas that are overexposed on the back of the camera preview. There's a bunch more changes one can make in the blue menu, but most of the items I'll leave untouched. In the purple menu, we basically don't have to make any changes unless we want to connect our camera to our phone or tablet or transfer images to an FTP server, for instance. In case of the R1, it will usually ask you at the first use to connect to your phone. And if you have the Canon Camera Connect app, you can then do a few cool functions like shooting remotely with the camera through the app, which can be quite helpful at times. Now we're on to the yellow menu, and here we'll make a few changes. In the first yellow tab in the record function and card folder selection, we can select whether we want to write on one card or both cards at the same time, whether we want photos on one card and videos on another card, and a few other interesting items. Because the R1 has two CF Express Type B card slots, it now actually makes sense, for instance, to write to both cards at the same time to have an instant backup. So depending on your situation and how many cards you have and how many images you expect to take, probably writing to both cards at the same time is the safest, but could also be overkill in many situations because most of these modern cards really never fail. So if you want to have an instant backup, you have to select record to multiple. Otherwise, I would recommend selecting auto switch card. Then the camera will automatically switch from card 1 once it's full to card 2 and keep writing. A bit further down in the record play menu for photo and video, you can also select which card to write to. And if you go into that menu and actually press info, you can also give priority to the first card, for instance. So whenever card 1 is inserted into the camera will first write to that card. And at the very bottom, we can select what folder we want the camera to write our files to, and we can actually also rename those folders. The next item in the first yellow menu is the file name, and here I usually like to just go in and change the file name settings to my initials, for instance, but you can also change that to whatever you want or leave the defaults. It doesn't really matter because most people usually rename the images after downloading anyways. The only thing to remember here is if you're selecting Adobe RGB, then the first letter of the file name will be replaced with an underscore. The rest of these menus should be pretty self-explanatory, but one interesting item here still is the format card, because I would always recommend that you format your memory cards in the camera before you actually use them. And sometimes it's also recommended to help the cards and clean up the cards to select low-level format, which should help with the performance and the longevity of the cards. The second yellow menu is an interesting one because here, for instance, we can select the camera sounds, and it also determines what frame rates are displayed in our video section later on. So the first important item to look at here is the system frequency. If you're in North America, it will be set to NTSC, and in most other countries, it will be set to PAL. However, depending on what you select here, you will either have like 24, 30, 60, 120 frames per second if you select NTSC, or 25, 50, 100 frames per second if you select PAL. This is for video only, but if you're later in video mode and for instance you only see 25 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second, this will be the reason because you will have PAL instead of NTSC selected. For photos and filming wildlife outside, the system frequency doesn't matter as much, but when you film yourself inside with artificial light, selecting the right frequency can help to stop flickering. And now we get to the first very strange item in the Canon menu, because in order to access the shutter sound, we first have to enable the beep. Don't ask me why, it's just the way it is. So if you want to change any camera sounds, you have to first enable the beep, and that then allows us to select the volume menu item. And if we then go to the volume submenu, we can, for instance, select a nice and quiet shutter sound, or maybe a really loud one if that's how you roll. In the third yellow menu, I'll just make a few changes. For instance, I like to set the brightness to 7, which is the maximum, so it's easier to see the back of the camera on a bright sunny day. For the viewfinder, I usually leave the brightness on auto because I feel like if I set that too bright, it can kind of confuse me sometimes, and I think that a dark scene is actually brighter than it is. The next item that I make sure is set up properly is the screen or viewfinder display. And I like to set that to auto 2, which then allows to easily switch between the viewfinder or the rescreen, depending how close your face is to the camera. In the fourth yellow menu, I think I haven't made any changes, not even to the power settings. But if you feel like that your camera goes to sleep too quickly or disables the viewfinder too quickly, you can make those changes here and keep it up longer. But keeping it up for too long will definitely start chewing through your batteries. The fifth yellow menu is a very important one. First of all, we have our custom shooting modes here, and we also have the save and load camera settings. So if you're going to buy my R1 camera settings file, this is the menu where you will actually load that onto the camera. However, if you plan to install my settings onto your camera, I would first recommend that you make a copy of your own settings first by saving your settings. So in case you don't like my settings, you can put your old settings back on. And if you want to load my file, all you need to do is unzip the PDF guide that you've downloaded, put the camera settings file onto an empty memory card, slide it into an R1 without any other memory card present, and then navigate to the fifth yellow menu and go to Save Load Settings, go to Load, and that will automatically load all my settings onto your R1. The only downside with these camera settings files is that sometimes they don't save all settings. For instance, log mode in video is always turned off when you reinstall it. So it's a good idea to compare what you've installed with the camera settings file to this guide to make sure it's all working in order. When it comes to the custom shooting modes, this is where you can register settings for C1, C2, and C3. For photo, I don't use this too much, but for video, this works really well. The idea is that you dial in all your settings and shooting modes, and then register those to one custom mode. And whenever you go to that custom mode, it will remember those settings. And this can be very helpful, for instance, if you want to have one setting for animals and then one setting for people. So instead of always having to go to the menu and change everything over, you can now simply go from C1 for animals, for instance, to C2 that you've set up for people. And now you can make another decision, whether you want your camera to automatically update all the changes you make when you're in your custom mode, or if you want your custom mode to always stay the same. And we do that by either enabling or disabling the auto update settings. I usually have it enabled because it means if I make changes to the shutter speed, for instance, this custom mode will remember it, and if I go back to it next time, I will have my changes registered. Or if I change a setting in the menu, it will remember that. However, depending on how you're shooting, this can either be good or bad. Maybe, for instance, for video, you always want to have the same settings dialed in, and then I would turn the auto update settings off. Whereas for photos, I think in most cases, having it on probably makes a lot of sense. Next, we have the green menu, and this menu is quite important because we will assign lots of different functions and settings to the different buttons on our R1, and we also need this menu to finalize our double back button autofocusing setup. So to assign our buttons, we go to Customize Buttons for Shooting. And in this submenu, we can see on the left-hand side all the different buttons we can assign functions to for photo, and on the right-hand side all the different buttons we can assign functions to for video. The first item here we're going to change is our frame to shutter button, and I want to disable the autofocusing from that button. So I go into the submenu by pressing OK and selecting Metering Start Only. And by disabling the focusing function from the shutter button, I now have activated true back button autofocusing, where the shutter button doesn't interfere with my autofocusing. Another change I make in this menu is that I assign the MFN button on top of the camera to cycle through my different autofocusing areas. And that brings me to our double press AF on button, which is a little bit tricky to set up because we have so many options to choose from and so many submenus to go through, but bear with me, it's definitely worth it. On the R1, the AF on button is actually pretty crazy because we can assign so many different functions to that one button. So first of all, I want to assign animal eye tracking to the AF on button. So no matter if I do half press or full press, it will track my subject all over the viewfinder. Secondly, I want to assign that on half press it shoots in H mode, the second fastest shooting mode, and at full press it shoots in H+, the fastest shooting mode at 40 frames a second. And then I also want to assign on top of that I can move my thumb over the AF on button, and then that moves the autofocusing fields around. Another very good function. And to do that, we go to the AF on button submenu and go to AF on 3, option 3, where we have metering and AF start on half press, and on full press we get metering and AF start, plus also the switching between the continuous shooting modes. What's important here is that you don't confirm, because we now need to press info to access the sub settings of this AF on 3 option. So once you press info, you will see two options for half press and for fully press that we can now adjust again. And let's start with the fully press option. To do that, we select that option, but don't confirm and instead press info again. That brings us to another submenu. And on the fully press submenu, we make sure that we select switch electronic continuous shooting modes. But again, don't confirm because we need to press info again so we can select which mode you wanted to switch to. And here in that sub menu, we select H+ mode, which means that now if we fully press the button, we shoot at the fastest possible shooting mode. And now we can press OK and OK to get us back to our AF on 3 button submenu where we can now assign the half press function. And now we need to select the grayed out, metering and AF start. And don't confirm again because we need to press info again to select those subsettings. Metering and AF start is actually grayed out because this is what's defaulted to. So whether you half press or fully press, the AF on button will always do metering and autofocusing start on this option. So whether I half press or fully press, what we assign now for the half press will also be counting for the fully press. But on top of that, the fully press will also switch to the faster shooting mode. And now this menu definitely looks a bit crazy because here we can select many different options that we want the camera to execute when we half press or fully press the AF on button. And this is also the reason that I said at the beginning of this video in the pink menu that the grayed out items there don't matter, because what we select here will override these grayed out items anyways. Whatever we select with a tick in this menu will basically override the settings that we've chosen in the rest of the menu, whereas whatever items we leave unticked, it will then default to what we have set in the pink menu. To get the best possible performance from the AF on button, I've made the following selections. I tick the AF start position so the camera starts focusing from the current autofocus point. Then I set the AF operation to servo. I set the AF area to whole area. I enabled the whole area tracking servo autofocus, and here I also set my subject to detect animals. Next, I enabled the eye detection because I want the camera to obviously look for my animal's eye, and the rest I left unticked, so whatever I set in the pink menu will count. And now we press menu until we're back at our submenu and then select AF on 3, and that brings us back to the main custom buttons menu. So now we've assigned a bunch of functions already to the AF on button. On half press, we have a slower shooting mode. On full press, we have a fast shooting mode. And on both modes, fully and half press, we also engage the animal eye tracking and autofocusing. Now, we don't have any focusing yet assigned to our base autofocusing mode because we disabled the focusing from the shutter button. If you really like shutter button focusing, you could just leave it there. But in my case, I want to assign that to another back button, and in this case, the AE lock or star button. So I go to the menu, navigate to the star button or AE lock button, go to the submenu, and here I select metering and AF start. So now whenever I press the star button on the back of the camera, it will engage the autofocusing for our spot autofocus with no tracking base autofocusing mode. Next, I want to activate the smart controller function of the AF on button. So when I move my thumb over the AF on button, I'm also moving my autofocusing fields. And for that, I navigate to the AF on smart controller function. And in there, I select direct AF point selection. So now whenever I move my thumb, the autofocusing point will move. However, the standard is too fast for me, but we have to slow that down in another menu. And once I slow it down, I actually really like that function. Whereas on the default settings, I feel like I move it too aggressively or too quickly whenever I just press the button. On my R1, I've actually assigned triple back button autofocusing. And the idea is that the third button, in my case the AF point selection button, acts as an emergency or high image quality button depending on how you set it up. However, I think if I showed you this now, it would get too confusing and this video would get way too long. So you can either check out my guide where I show you that setup and all my settings there as well, or I'll make another video about that topic at some stage as well. But for now, I think it's important that we move on with the rest of this menu and the other menus because there's still a lot of things to set up and I don't want to confuse you too much by jumping into this menu and then setting up another 1,000 submenus. However, if you really want to deep dive into it, I'll just tell you quickly. You go to the AF point selection button, you select register or recall shooting function, you press info, and then you can set up 1,000 settings that you want to dial in that will then override your current camera settings whenever you press that button. So depending on what settings you dial in, maybe high shutter speed or low shutter speed, it can be your action button or your high quality image button. Next, I want to set up the multi-controller or joystick on the back of my camera. And I like to also set that to be able to move the autofocusing fields around, so I activate that. And because we're all loving to press info so much on the R1, in this case, I'm also pressing info again because that allows me to also assign what happens when I press the joystick. And in my case, I find it really useful to set it to centering autofocus fields. Because for instance, when I use the AF on button and I accidentally move my autofocusing field around the viewfinder, I can simply press the joystick and it will be in the center again, which is very useful. Of course, there's a bunch more buttons on the R1 that you can assign functions to, and on the right hand side there's also the custom buttons for video mode, but I think for now that's probably enough buttons we've gone through, and our camera is working really well now the way we've set it up already. So let's quickly get out of the green custom button menu. I think we've done enough damage here now, and jump to the second green menu. Here the first item, the photo video switch, of course I'll leave the switch between photo and video, and the second item, the smart controller, I put to on, because that enables the function that we can move our thumb around and move the autofocusing fields on the AF on button with our thumb. Also, here we can select by pressing the Q button this time, how sensitive the autofocus fields responds to our thumb movements. And I like to set it to -2, the slowest movements, because I think on the faster movements, it just moves the field too fast for me. In the third green menu, I basically left everything the same, except that I made sure that the AF area selection control is set to the MFN button. I think we already assigned it, but since you can select it here again, I just make sure that I select the same, so whenever I press the MFN button, it cycles through my remaining AF areas and lets me really quickly choose between the different ones. The fifth green menu gives us an interesting option, the eye control autofocus, where the camera follows the movement of our eye, and if we look at a certain point, we can press a button and then the camera will move the focus and tracking to that point. In theory, this is great. However, I've found it to be too unreliable in the field to use on a consistent basis, so I basically keep it off on my R1 all the time. If you want to use the eye-controlled autofocus or just have a play around with it, you have to turn it on, and then you have to calibrate the camera and teach it your eye and your movement in many different scenarios, and then save those, and this will enable the camera to then track your eye, hopefully properly in the field. If you want to use the eye control autofocus properly as well, I would recommend that you assign one of the back buttons to moving autofocus point and start autofocus by eye control, and then also assign the light button on top of the camera, for instance, to turn eye control on and off really quickly, so you can easily turn it off if you don't want to use it anymore. I explained the eye control autofocus a little bit more in detail in my guide, and I've also made a section in my R5 Mark II setup video where I explain it also in a little bit more detail. But for now, I think it's important that you just know that you need to turn it on, calibrate the settings, and then you can see it sort of working. Here's just one more recommendation when it comes to the eye-controlled autofocus, because for me, I always found it annoying to have that yellow or purple pointer in my viewfinder all the time following my eye. And you actually don't need it. This function also works without the pointer. So what I would do is go to the menu and then turn the pointer off. The camera will still track your eye movement, but you don't have that crazy pointer going around anymore. And for me, I felt like that worked a little bit better. And that brings us to the orange menu, which has gotten a lot slimmer on the R5 Mark II and the R1 because a lot of the functions that were previously in the orange menu have now moved into the green photo menu. And the first thing I like to do in the first tab of the orange menu is to restrict the shooting modes that I'm not using. So when I press the mode dial on top of the camera, instead of having to go through like 5 or 6 different modes, I just have manual mode and my 3 custom functions available, so I can really quickly switch between these different modes without having to go through all the other modes. The fourth orange menu is quite important because here we can select the frame rate available for our different shooting modes. And because we're using the half press and fully press function, the H mode and H plus mode become very important because here we can select at how many frames each of those 2 modes actually shoots. One thing we have to remember the way we set up the R1 now is because we selected H shooting speed, the second fastest shooting speed, as our drive mode, our base autofocusing mode will also only shoot at that frame rate, and we only get the fastest frame rate, the 40 frames per second, by fully pressing the AF on button. And this is the reason that I've selected 20 or 30 frames per second as my high speed or H mode, because I still want my base mode to also have high frames per second available. But if you know that you don't need 20 or 30 frames per second for your basic camera operation on half press or when you use the base autofocusing mode, you could also set that to something slower, and then the AF on button at fully press would feel even more like a speed boost option. And then we have just one more important option in the orange menu, and that is on tab number 5, retract lens on power off. This is on by default, but it's bad because we want to turn that off. If this is on, it means that your camera completely defocuses every time it goes to sleep or turns off. And this is very annoying, especially if you use long lenses. So my recommendation is to turn that off. And that brings us to the last tab, the dark green My Menu tab. On the R1, I usually don't set it up, but I use it a lot on my R5 Mark II where I quickly need to switch between different menu items. And the idea here is that you can create your own personalized custom menu. So if you want to use it, you can simply go to Add My Menu tab. And then in that My Menu tab, you can go to Configure, and then you can select Items to Register. And that basically allows you to select any item from the menu and put that into your My Menu for quick and easy access. And the best thing is that if you have all your important items in your My Menu, you can also go to My Menu Management and at the bottom go to Menu Display and then select Display from My Menu tab. And then whenever you press Menu on your camera, it doesn't go to a random menu, but will show your My Menu page first. Getting the right settings dialed in and taking nice rules is only the start though. Learning a fast and efficient editing workflow is what will truly make your images stand out. And that is why I developed my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses. In my classes, I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters the most important tools and techniques, some of which you probably never heard of, that make all the difference and will allow you to confidently transform all your raw files and get great results with ease. But of course, you won't just be watching because I'm also providing you with my own raw files so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, check out some of the amazing reviews I've already received from many happy students who I've helped to transform their editing lives, who now get great results with ease and actually enjoy the editing process. So if you want to turn your time in front of the computer from a frustrating chore where you don't really know what to do or what sliders to pull into a rewarding experience where you have an easy to follow workflow that you can apply to all your own raw files and get great results every time, I'd highly recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses down there in the description. I know they will help you a lot. So that concludes the photo setup for the R1, but there's still a few important video settings to change. And to do that, you actually have to change the switch on the back of the camera to video, and that will then allow you to access the video menu. There's a lot of overlap with the photo menu, so I will only focus on the most important video changes to make. The R1 takes beautiful oversampled video in many different modes. I've really enjoyed taking video files with it. However, navigating the video menu is actually quite difficult because depending on what you select in one menu, that might completely change what you see in a different menu. So whenever you feel like something is missing from one menu, that might be because you actually selected something else in a different menu that now disables what's in the other menu. Kind of confusing, but I'll try to run you through it. So first we have our movie recording size. Here we select resolution, frame rate, and the compression. And what frame rates you see available in this movie recording size is not only determined by what we select in the other menus below, but also what you have selected in the yellow menu number 2, whether you selected NTSC or PAL there. So if you don't have the right frame rates, check out the yellow menu, but also some of the other steps that we go through now. The second item on this slide is called the high frame rate, and we have to enable that in order to be able to shoot at 100 or 120 or 240 frames per second. If this is not enabled, you will not see the high frame rates in the movie recording size and you're not able to select them. However, if you enable the high frames per second, it will gray out all the other options in the movie recording size. Next, in this first red menu tab, we have the main recording format, which lets us select our codec, like RAW for instance, or other options. However, depending on the codec we select here, we will have different options showing up in the movie recording size menu, for instance, when it comes to the compression. And lastly, we have the movie cropping, which I usually disable, but it gives you a 1.6 crop on your video and it's still 4K resolution, but not oversampled. So if your subject is really far away, this could be a good option. So before I go into more detail about these video options, you can see it's definitely crazy to change all these different things and that having a different effect on all the other different settings. And this is the main reason that I love using custom shooting modes for video, because it takes care of all this mess. I just have to set it up once and then I can forget about it and just use the mode dial and go to like C1 if I want to have a certain setting. So what I like to do is to set C1 to 4K oversampled 25 frames per second to film myself. custom function 2 or custom mode 2 to 100 or 120 frames per second to film slow motion. And then custom mode 3, which is very important, I set to normally oversampled 4K at 50 or 60 frames per second to film most of my wildlife. Custom mode 3 is actually the most important mode because whatever you select there will be defaulted to whenever you press the red record button on the back of the R1 in photo mode. So I would make sure that you always have great settings dialed in there, but I'll talk about the custom modes a little bit more later on. So let's look at the movie recording size menu in a little bit more detail. So let's say I want to film myself, so I select 4KD, which is the widest 4K, so I can have a little bit more room for cropping on the sides. As my frame rate, in the second tab, I want 25 frames a second. And then in the third tab, I have different compression algorithms available. In my case, I like the highest quality video, so I select the high quality or intro algorithm. So now you know how to navigate the movie recording size. Now let's jump back to the main recording format and select a good codec. If you select RAW, then you can only film in 6K RAW, but these files will be very big and will also be quite hard to edit. And you will have different compression algorithms for RAW available in that third tab in the other menu. After RAW, we have two HEVC-S options, which are H.265 codecs, which are much smaller and much more compressed. However, if we select any of these two options, the R1 will only allow us to use the lowest LGOP compression algorithm in the movie recording size third tab. So my recommendation for the best quality would be to go to the AVC-S and then select the 422 10-bit codec. So if you make the selections that I've made now, 4K oversampled, high intro compression algorithm, and a 10-bit codec, you definitely end up with big video files. So for most users, I think it would also be alright to use the HEVC-S codec and then use the LGOP compression, which will still give you decent looking video, but just doesn't have as much information in it as some of the other files. But in the end, it depends how much editing you want to do and also how big your video files will turn out. And that concludes the first red tab, and that's definitely a lot of information to digest, but basically remember that you can't set everything in the one menu item. You basically have to constantly change between 2 or 3 different menu items to get all the settings that you want to work together. And this is exactly why I love using the custom function, so I don't have to do that all the time. Setting up a video custom mode is actually identical to setting up photo custom modes, except that you're in video mode now. So all you need to do is dial in all the video settings that you want to have in one custom mode. For instance, you go in and select 4K, 120 frames per second, and make all your other changes, set your frame rate, set your aperture, set your ISO. And then once you have all your settings that you want to save to that mode dialed in, you go to the yellow menu number 5, and then you go to custom shooting modes, go to register settings, and then register that to one of the custom modes. And now when you're in video mode and whenever you press the top dial, you just go to that custom mode and that will then have all your slow motion settings there. And just like with photo, you can also decide if you want to enable or disable the auto update settings. The fourth red menu for video is also an interesting one because here we can decide if we want to shoot in standard picture format or in a log format. Log format is very helpful when you're filming in video because it takes all contrast out of your files and gives you super good dynamic range, but at the same time it means you definitely have to edit those files. So if you're a bit of a lazy editor or don't want to edit your videos or don't have a very powerful computer, shooting in a standard picture profile is probably the better idea. So to select the look of your videos, you can go to picture style just like in photo, but it's a different menu. And then for video, I'd probably recommend using the neutral mode and also making sure that you don't have too much sharpening applied because that can look quite strange sometimes. And that will give you a nice, even, neutral looking video file. You could also use standard if you want a bit more punchy colors, but I wouldn't go too aggressive because it's better to have a more neutral looking video and then do a little bit of editing later on. To enable log shooting, you have to go to custom picture and then go to custom picture function and turn that on. And then where it says select custom picture file, I'll go in and select Canon log 2. It's a little bit harder to edit than Canon log 3, but it also has the maximum dynamic range available, which is very important when you're shooting in scenarios where you have, for instance, a bright background and a dark bird. In the fifth red menu tab, I also like to set a custom white balance for video anywhere between like 5100 and 5800 Kelvin to make sure that the auto white balance isn't messing up my video files because it's a lot harder to adjust the white balance in videos than it is in photos. In the eighth red menu, we have another interesting item, the zebra settings. And here I like to turn them on because it gives me that visual representation of areas that are too bright in my videos. And when it comes to the zebra settings themselves, I try to not have them too aggressive because they then show up all the time and can be a bit annoying. So I set pretty high settings just before it burns out. Red menu number 9 is very similar to the photo menu, except that we can now choose in video mode what items we want to have displayed on the rear screen and in our ABF. And in the 10th menu, I just make a couple changes. The first one is that I select the auto power off temperature to high, because I want the camera to film as long as possible without shutting down and overheating. Now the camera can still overheat, but it will take a lot longer for the camera to shut off compared to setting it to just the standard cutoff temperature. And that brings us to the pink video autofocusing menu. The autofocus for video is very different because instead of pressing a button and then focusing or constantly controlling an autofocus point, my go-to for video is usually to have the whole area tracking activated where the camera finds the subject for me, and then I also have the continuous tracking activated where the camera continuously tracks my subject for me, so I basically don't have to touch the camera at all and the camera does all the tracking for me. In the first tab of the pink menu, I selected Movie Servo Autofocus and obviously turned that on because I want the camera to constantly track my subject. And in the Movie Servo Autofocus submenu, I like to select Movie Servo Enable obviously, and the Subject Detection Autofocus to detect priority. And then the second point, the autofocus area, I went in again, and here you can see I also deselected some of the options that I don't want to use, which we can do in another menu later. And as you can see, this is different to my photo menu because for video I'm using different autofocusing areas than I use for photo. Normally whole area is fine, but sometimes I want to use a smaller zone or even the spot autofocus if the video autofocus gets too confused in the whole area mode. In the second video autofocus menu, I made sure that I select the subjects to detect to animal, eye detection to auto, and switching track subject I left on 1. If you feel like the camera is going too quickly between subjects or jumps off your subject or is too slow, I would recommend that you go to this setting and then make some changes, either making it more aggressive or less aggressive. In the third tab, the Movie Servo Autofocus Speed and the Movie Autofocus Tracking Sensitivity are both left on 0 as well, because that has worked quite well for me so far. But if you feel like the camera's too aggressive or not aggressive enough, making some changes here can also help. Even though for video, especially the Movie Servo Speed, you don't want too fast because then the transitions won't look natural anymore. In the fourth tab, we have our friend the lens drive when autofocus impossible. And in this case here, I've set it to off, which means that basically the camera doesn't hunt for focus. And I have to precisely pre-focus for the camera to then jump onto my subject. The reason I like that for video is because oftentimes, at least in theory, it stops the camera to jump off my subject and onto the background. If the background is close to your subject, it could still happen, but if you have a bird on a perch, for instance, and it moves around, the camera will not suddenly focus on your background because you're basically not allowing it to focus hunt unless it can clearly see a subject. And for video, I think that's good, but it does mean I always need to neatly pre-focus or it won't focus at all, even if I press a button. In the fifth menu, I've just gone in and limited the autofocusing area by deactivating all the ones that I'm not using for video. The rest are left at default, and in the sixth pink menu, I made sure that I went in and also turned on the lens electronic manual autofocus so I can always manually interfere when my camera is focusing. For instance, if it's stuck on the background for whatever reason, I can quickly bring it back onto my subject. Or I can also help it by pre-focusing close to my subject with the manual focus. The other setting that is currently grayed out that I would recommend to turn on if you're doing a lot of manual focus is the manual focus peaking. Currently it's disabled because I have the zebras activated, but if you're doing a lot of manual focus, I would recommend to turn on the manual focus peaking and also the focus guide, which will help you to make sure that you're always on your target when manually focusing. Compared to the photo menu, I haven't made any changes in the blue, the purple, or the yellow menu. But remember that in the yellow menu, we can select the PAL or NTSC video standard that determines our frame rates. And also in the yellow menu, of course, this is where we set our custom shooting modes, which are very important for video, especially that custom function number 3. And that brings us to the green video menu. Here we can assign different functions to different buttons on the camera. For video, I'll leave most of these as default. But for instance, on the first green tab, I like to go to the shutter button function for movies and then also allow the shutter button to record movies. For instance, when I'm hand holding, I find it much easier to grab the camera and just switch it into movie mode and then press the shutter button rather than having to always find the button on the back of the camera. So I can record with the red recording button, but also with the shutter button, which I really like. You can also go to the customize buttons for shooting and then on the right hand side select all your custom buttons for video. I haven't made any crazy changes here, but for instance I like to have the MFN button for video to turn on and off the video servo autofocus. So if the focus goes completely crazy, I can stop it with that button, refocus, and then turn it back on. In the third screen menu, I went to the AF area selection control and then selected the main dial on top to switch me through the different autofocusing modes after pressing the AF point selection button, rather than going with the MFN button because I've already assigned a different function to that MFN button. And that brings us to the end of this video. I think this was the longest video I've ever filmed and probably the hardest camera I've ever set up. So definitely not an easy task, but I hope we all got there in the end. We'll get some fantastic results with our R1 cameras. I really hope these settings will help you a lot, and if you want to get a little cheat code or shortcut, I'd highly recommend that you check out my setup guide and especially my camera setup file, because that will allow you to have all these settings in no time. So check these out down there in the description. Also let me know in the comments, did you find this video helpful? Is there any changes that you would make? Let me know. Also give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my channel membership and my masterclasses, and of course hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!